your act of cheating is completely on you, right? That's an individual choice. The dysfunction that has led us here is both of us. And that's a very difficult space for us to sort of get to with the clients, because the person that on the other side that didn't cheat is going to go through that hurt, that pain, that sense of betrayal and things like that. So you need to fix this.
Welcome back to Be Kind to Your Mind. Today's episode is about something we all live through, our relationships. Whether it's with a partner, our family, or the people closest to us, these bonds shape so much of our emotional well-being. When they're healthy, relationships give us support, security, and joy. But when they're strained, they can be one of the biggest sources of stress, anxiety, and even trauma. To help us explore this, I'm joined by Christine Mariana, a licensed marriage and family therapist who has worked extensively with couples and families. Christine brings not only professional expertise, but also a compassionate perspective on how relationships affect our mental health. If you've ever felt the weight of relationship struggles in your personal life, or wondered how therapy can support not just individuals but entire families, this episode is for you. Let's get started. Christine, welcome to Be Kind to Your Mind. And I think your role is quite unique in Malaysia. Not many marriage and family therapists are available here locally, from my understanding. Perhaps we can begin with a quick introduction of yourself.
All right. Thank you, Elvin. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and currently I am practicing at Heal Systemic Therapy, and also I'm pursuing my PhD in gender studies, and I'm also hoping to get my lembaga license so that I could practice as a counselor in Malaysia.
Meaning to say that you are doing your master's and a PhD at the same time.
Yes, but my master's is more for the reason of getting my license and less of sort of learning the skills and the theories behind it, because it's very similar to what I've already received before in the US.
Yeah, so I understand that you already have a license in the US.
Yes.
But then you relocated back to Malaysia, and the legislation here is a little bit different, and not so much of legislation for marriage and family therapy, hence the counseling license that you're pursuing.
Yes, correct.
Maybe to get the audience to better understand what's the difference between the different professions. There is the clinical psychologist, there's a counselor, as well as marriage and family therapist. In your training and as well as a professional opinion, what's the difference that separates you, a marriage and family therapist, and perhaps a counselor or a clinical psychologist?
Right. Yeah, so I'm so glad that you asked that question, Elvin, because I think a lot of people, especially the general public, they're not very clear on who to go to and what kind of help to receive. So I'll just give a brief sort of like history on how family therapy started. It wasn't too long ago. It was only in the 1950s. So what happened was that there was this patient that was having schizophrenia, and he was being treated at the hospital. And every time after being treated, he gets better, where he felt more calm or more connected, and symptoms were reducing. But then whenever he went back home, his symptoms recurs. So, and this happened a few times. So that's how this whole idea of family therapy came about, where psychiatrists started noticing that maybe the problem is not so much in the individual, but in the system. So that's when Gregory Bateson, he's one of the pioneers in family therapy, who introduced, he worked with the team to sort of bring out these ideas of how families function, and that a lot of the issues, especially mental health issues, is not so much within the individual, but perhaps it's in the pattern of the relationships. Yeah. So how we are different as family therapists is, if a client comes in with depression, for example, a clinical psychologist will focus more on the assessment of their symptoms and giving more objective evaluations and seeing whether or not they fit in the diagnosis of the DSM. Whereas a counselor might focus more on the coping, on how to function and how to basically not allow the symptoms to get in the way of your day-to-day. But a family therapist will be not so focused on the symptoms, because we see the symptoms as a call for help. So we're more interested in the system itself. So when a client comes in, yes, we will take note of the symptoms, but we are more interested to see when it started, how it started, what's going on in your family. Tell me more about the relationships in your family, and so on and so forth. I hope that's clear.
The analogy that I can think of is something like, maybe if someone or a living organism, right? It could be a person or a cell. When one part of the cell isn't functioning as well, then the whole cell then begins to malfunction. Would that be a good analogy? So one individual who is depressed, let's say, but actually the sort of the quote unquote dysfunction is actually within the system that this individual is in, whether in the family or community or relationship.
Yeah. Yes. So it's the conditions that have been created that probably cause the cell to mutate, for example. So it's not a mutation that just happened out of nowhere.
Yeah, so it doesn't happen on an individual basis. You're looking at like sort of when you refer to the system, then it refers to the environment and the relationships that these people have with either their family, their friends, and maybe their romantic partner.
Correct.
Okay. So I think now that we are in this topic of how others actually affect this individual who presents themselves into therapy, how does that actually work? So how does relationships, or how do family or romantic relationships actually affects an individual's mental health? So you likely begin by seeing firstly that person coming in, right? One individual. And then you are then looking at more towards how his environment is like. So how is that connection made actually? How can we actually understand this a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think for one is, as a family therapist, the understanding of systems thinking is very important. So we have to believe that everything makes sense in context, or everything can be understood within the context of relationships specifically. So when a client comes in, we have to keep in mind, like, this person is not just an individual, but he or she is part of systems where he has learned. So families are usually like our first classroom, right, of relationships, like what is love, regulation of emotion. So we learn this a lot from families, not so much even formally learned, like it's not told to us, but rather we learn through observational behaviors and things like that. So what we can be curious about is, where is this coming from? Where did you learn this? So like a genogram is an example of how you can get a lot of information. So if a client comes in and says that I'm having depression, so what I'll be interested to know more about is, can I know more about your family? And can I know about the patterns that exist in your family? And so we start by asking questions in regards to like, who's in the family, what was the relationship between the person's parents like, what messages did this person receive. So we have this very important term called double bind, where conflicting messages are sent. So for example, a father can be telling a son, I love you. But at the same time, when the son wants to come and hug the father is like stiffening the body, and also it's a very confusing message. So these kinds of messaging can create confusion in an individual, because they're like, do you love me or do you not love me? You know, because you're saying one thing, but your action is showing something else. So this is how we try to unpack within an individual. Like, and it's not just family. I also want to extend it to culture, messages that they receive about their gender, messages they receive from their country, ethnic groups. So all these things, there are constant messages that we receive in influencing how to be and how to behave and how to think.
So, Christine, you've spoken about the word genogram, and just for the audience back home, a genogram refers to something like a family tree and how you plot out different members in the family and the nature of their relationships to them. And one kind of relationship that can be established among family members would be a communication pattern like the double bind, like you've mentioned, where the relationship is one of a conflicting message, perhaps one of love but also rejection at the same time. And I can imagine that can be quite confusing for an individual. But how does this, for example, conflicting messages or maybe certain roles that are being imposed on the individual as part of being within a community or within a family, how does this then affect the individual to the extent that it becomes like a symptom, like depression is a symptom, let's say, in view of the system? So how does this symptom actually show due to all these sort of influences on the individual?
Right. Yeah. So when for example, if there are these kinds of confusions within, it's called double bind because it's like if you do either one, you're still stuck, right? Like no matter what I do, I'm still gonna get in trouble because usually this kind of messages comes from like parents and then they get criticized or punished for it. So what happens is that when they get these kind of confusing messages, it starts to present itself either as anxiety or depression or bipolar. Like it starts to present itself in that manner. So when a client comes in and if you just focus on the symptoms, so it's like similar to what I shared earlier about the schizophrenic patient, right? Like, okay, they learn the skill, they learn that it's not really me and things like that. But then when they go back home, they're going back to a system that is continuing this kind of patterns. So then that's where the issue is. So the issue is not so much the individual, but it's more on the patterns, right? So what we want to do is we want to see how we could break those patterns, right? Like how we could unpack, like maybe there needs to be more congruent communication, or maybe there's something going on between the dad and the mom that's not being talked about, where the child becomes the focus. Yeah, so these are some of the ways that we try to sort of expand rather than just focusing on the individual.
What you're saying is that if you work with the individual and to elicit change with the individual, it wouldn't be sustainable because then they return to their family or return to their relationships or return to their community and then continue to be in the same pattern of relationships, which then makes their symptoms recur.
Yes, correct. And the other thing I want to add is even let's say they set boundaries with their families, right? Like, okay, I set boundaries with my family. I don't want to be part of the system because it's unhealthy for me and things like that. But if they don't have an idea and understanding of like how they were part of a patterning, what happens is, for example, let's say you grew up in a family where you had a very critical father, right? So you're going to have this thing about, I don't want to be that way to my child, right? So I'm going to be loving, I'm going to be compassionate, I'm not going to be critical, but you may end up going to the other end of the spectrum. So then you might end up being so like compassionate and kind and loving, but to the point that you don't discipline your child, because of the reaction that you've had from your parent. Then what happens is your child grew up having some kind of behavioral issue. Then your child will grow up feeling like, oh, my dad was not very, he didn't really give any consequences and I wish that he would have stopped me from doing certain things. Then they would probably end up being critical as your dad was. So that this is also one way where we see like multi-generational patterning as well. So when a client comes in, so let's say like they are going for individual counseling and then they've worked through some things on their own, they figured out some coping, getting some understanding, and then they decided to set some boundaries with their family of origin. We call it family of origin, like the parents. But what happens is that if they don't have clarity on systems thinking, even the clients themselves, if they don't understand that they are part of relationships, so when they start to have their own children, out of reaction from how their experiences is with their dad, they might end up being like on the opposite side, right? Like not being too strict or not being too critical, and then being too permissive to some extent. So then this then creates a pattern where the child may end up repeating what the grandfather used to be, which is like they might grow up into an adult. Like, I want to be a strict parent because my dad, was not, he wasn't paying attention to me and things like that. Yeah. So this is also one way to look at like patterns as to how we are and who we are is very much a reaction from the relationships that we are part of.
Mm-hmm. So it is on one part understanding systems thinking, but on the other part, given that the client is a participant within the system, it's also a sort of, would you say that it's something like they are already caught in the system, hence, even if they're aware of it, it's quite difficult to act differently?
Yeah, so to some extent, I guess the core of it is to understand that who we are makes sense in the context of relationships. So a lot of how I want to be could be a reaction from a fear of being criticized, or like if I come from a very critical family, how I'm going to be at my workplace, how I'm going to be in my friendships, how I'm going to be with my future partner, with my children. It will always be a reaction because of the energy and the messaging that I've received, right? So even though I may learn some tools, etc., right? But if my relationship with my parents is not healed, and healing can come in many different forms, but if it's not healed, it will always somehow be there to some extent. So that awareness is very important, right? Like, so for example, cutting off. If you cut off from your family, some people may see that as healthy, but some family therapists might argue as that's a very reactionary way to be, right? Because you are coming from a place of disconnection.
It almost sounds like on an individual basis, if you were to come in for therapy, then changes that are made on an individual basis, once they go back to their environment and their existing relationships, that they would revert to their previous, quote unquote, dysfunction. So in that regard, then how do you assist these clients in the therapy? Do you have to involve family members, or do you have to involve other people aside from the individual?
Right. Well, there's so many multiple approach to it, Alvin. So one of it is, for me, what I look for is the shift in the mindset of the client themselves. So for them to see that you're not an individual, right? You are part of systems, and systems has a lot of influence on you, and you have a lot of influence on the system. So it's a very relational relationship. So one of it is the shift in mindset. So sometimes we can do a lot of relational work with figurines. So like kind of like bringing people in. But like for me personally, I prefer to have more people in the room than less people, because then I get to see patterns, I get to see dynamics, because we believe that the problem is not in the individual. So it's not to blame and say, you have anger management issues, you need to work on it. If you fix your anger, we will be better as a family, right? So as family therapists, the first thing we want is to shift that mindset. The person who's having anger, it's not so much you are to be blamed, but it's more about what is happening between the spaces of you and your family members. And for the individuals that's blaming the person that's having anger, for them to also understand that there are certain things that's happening in the way I communicate, or in the way that the dynamic is that's triggering. So to understand that is very important.
And if the individual then develops insight that, okay, this is the pattern of the relationship that I have with this other individual. So when I maybe behave in this way, the other person will react in another way, and therefore I'll react in this way. How does that awareness then elicit change in the individual that is in therapy with you? How does the individual then improve their functioning?
Right. So once there's that greater understanding, so let me give you a very potent example, right? So let's say it's a couple, and there's an affair. Okay. So, and let's say it's us, right? So let's say you cheated. As the husband, you cheated. So the very common understanding is that you messed up, right? Because you cheated, and you had an affair. You broke the trust. You broke whatever is it that was holding this marriage. So as a family therapist, one very important thing, or couples therapist, one very important thing we do is that first is to sort of share this understanding that your act of cheating is completely on you. All right, that's an individual choice. However, the dysfunction that has led us here is both of us. Right? So, and that's a very difficult space for us to sort of get to with the clients, because the person that is on the other side that didn't cheat is going to go through that hurt, that pain, that sense of betrayal and things like that. So they're unable to see that I didn't do anything wrong. You need to fix this, right? So, but what has happened is that there has been a pattern before the affair happened that is dysfunctional. So both of them need to first understand that, right? There's been a dysfunction here, and are you open and willing to work through this dysfunction or not before even that affair happens? So what is happening is, because of this dysfunction, this particular individual didn't know how to deal with whatever that was happening in the relationship. So their way of taking care of themselves is to cheat, right? And this person perhaps was unaware that there is a dysfunction in the relationship. Because I've had couples where this other person is sort of like, in their reality is more like, we had a phenomenal relationship, or I was an incredible wife or a partner. Like, I didn't do anything. Like, I cooked, I cleaned, I did everything, so, but perhaps there was something there that was creating some kind of emotional distance. So helping them to get to that is an example of how, yes, you have some individual work to work on, but there's also some relational aspect that we need to look at.
I would think that it's quite a difficult reality to accept. So let's say a couple come in and the primary concern is about an affair, or maybe an individual comes in and they're depressed or they're anxious or whatever presenting concern that they might have. And then you are seeing it more as perhaps due to certain patterns of relationships within family members, that the initial resistance will come from people who are other than the client that you're seeing, whether it's their partner or their family members. Is quite, I imagine it's going to be quite difficult for them to accept that, hey, it's actually because I'm contributing to this. Would that be?
Yeah,
right?
It is very difficult, but that's where we constantly, patiently, compassionately keep inviting our clients to hold this complexity, that it's not about one individual's responsibility to fix things, that problems exist in patterns. And I like to do this analogy of like clapping my hand, like if there is something going on between two people, you don't hear a sound when it's just one hand moving, right? Like you hear a sound when there's two hands moving. So yes, this person is contributing in these ways. Like you can clearly see it. It's easier to point finger and say, you need to change, you have this problem and that problem. But can I know what you think you are doing that's producing that sound? So sort of like consistently, patiently inviting them to help to see that they have a part to play. It's a big challenge, but it's also like a breakthrough moment. Because then they will start to see that I probably also need to change certain things that I've been doing, or I need to be more aware of my fears, my concerns, my worries that comes from my family that I am bringing into this system.
Okay, Christine. So it sounds like on an individual basis, it's less complex to address as a therapist, because someone comes in and they might share about their personal concerns. And then typically, a therapist would want to directly address those concerns with the individual themselves. But in your work, what you want to do is to get everyone's participation equally. Let's say in the context of a couple and an affair, that both the husband and wife both understand that they are equally playing certain roles that then results in the affair. So not so much of having one individual that's identified and to be blamed, but rather is through the context of everyone that is within that concern. So if it's an affair, then it's the relationship, the marriage. If it's, let's say, a child that's maybe not doing well at school, so it might be in the context of the family. So what are the parents doing? So now that I think you provided an example about a couple having an affair. What other concerns that typically a family and marriage therapist would want to address with individuals coming into therapy?
So in my experience, most of the issues I see, so I comment from like two angles, okay, Alvin? One is content. So in regards to content, like the issue itself, very common is we see like affairs, and we see things like communication, like where the partners are unable to come to a certain agreement or they really have different values, so communication is hard. And then we also see a lot of involvement of in-laws, because in more Asian culture, there seems to be more sort of, especially like among certain cultures, like there's like this filial piety that you see, So what happens is like after you're married, especially if it's like you're a son and if you're, for example, from a Chinese culture, like, your responsibility to your family and your current new family. So those issues I see quite a bit as well. So these are more of the content, right? But then when we look from a process part of it, a lot of these issues actually have a pattern that is quite universal, which is you see a pattern of not feeling not being heard, not being seen in the relationships. There is a way where we call it pursuer distancer, like someone is pursuing, which means I'm chasing after the relationship because I'm so scared that I'm going to be abandoned. Or you'll see the other person as withdrawing, like, give me space, give me time, I don't want to talk about it. This person's coming from a place of that fear of being rejected. So like, I rather not take the first step, because if I take the first step and you reject me, I can't stand that rejection. So that's more on the process bit, right? So regardless of what the content is that I see, there is some universal human experiences. But of course, we need to see it from a more cultural aspect as well. And I also just want to comment a little bit about the affair earlier. So I will make it very loud and clear that the person who cheated, the act of cheating is 100% the responsibility of that particular individual. So they have to take responsibility for how they chose to cope with that dysfunction in the relationship. But the dysfunction itself, entirely the dysfunction itself, is both the responsibility of the individual. Now that's the part that's very hard to swallow, especially for the other party. So I just wanted to emphasize that, because very often people will feel like, oh, are you trying to say that my husband cheated, but are you trying to say that I'm the cause of it as well? So that's very hard to people to understand that, no, I'm not saying that you are the cause, but I'm saying that there's a dysfunction that's already happening prior to the act of the affair itself.
Yeah, so there can be both the ownership of the action, but also understanding that there are certain roles that are maintained within the context of the relationship that had then resulted in the circumstances being right for the action to be taken.
Yes.
And I think the concerns that you have raised about maybe certain roles that people take up that they might not be completely happy with, or certain roles that they participate in that is rather dysfunctional, or certain actions like having an affair, all those seems to make sense in the context of how relationships maintain these things. And I think that aside from families as well as romantic relationships, there are also a lot of cultural and perhaps the larger social pressure, like what you mentioned about filial piety, where it's more of a larger social construct that maybe males and females or the son or the daughter, they have certain roles that they have to play. And despite them not wanting to play those roles, they still have to. And I can see how that's related very much to the context of relationships. So if they do gain awareness of this, and as how a psychologist would address these concerns would be, maybe they have certain ways of coping, certain skills that we can teach them. But aside from the awareness that you might want to work with them on, okay, so this is happening because of so and so. Is that the way of how change happened? Would that affect how they are more actively playing their roles or not? Or how does that work? How does awareness actually help with it?
That's a very good question. So when I think about, besides just awareness, like this is happening and this is how so and so is contributing, I guess the ultimate thing that we want to look for is how the individuals feel safe with each other in the system. So it's sort of like that feeling of my needs are heard, my emotions are expressed, and there's no sort of like repercussion for wanting to share whatever I want to share. So that's ultimately what it is, right? That feeling, that emotional safety in a relationship. And how to get there is really about exploring with clients, like helping them to understand these are patterns that you've learned since young. And this is how it keeps you stuck in relationships. Do you want for it to be different? And if you want it to be different, what would it look like? What would it feel like? So there needs to be that intent on how do you want it to be different? And also we'll be very curious about what is informing those ideals, So maybe those ideals are informed by, I don't know, Disney movies. Like, I want to have a fairy tale marriage. I want to be like this and that. So even like sort of questioning on where these messages comes from and how that in itself can sometimes be very disruptive, because Disney movies, they're not realistic, So for you to think that a relationship can exist without any conflict is not realistic. So also kind of like challenging that and having an understanding or a common goal of what would a healthy relationship feels like, looks like, what would love feel like, what would you want it to be expressed like. So kind of like sort of letting go of messages or patterns that doesn't work anymore and making an informed decision on how we want it to be. And there needs to be intent in it.
So I have a question here because earlier when it was mentioned that if we teach the individual skills and then they return to the environment with their existing relationships, the pattern of the relationships are still the same. Hence, the individual perhaps doesn't improve or reverts to whatever problems that the person might be having. And what you're saying here is that when there's awareness and this intent is developed within the individual to make certain changes, then improvement can happen. But can the work that you do happen on an individual basis, like just one client in the room? Or must it happen in participation with whoever this individual has a relationship with? Is it possible to have just one individual change and then the...
Well, I believe it is, but I believe that the sustainability of that change is probably not as I don't know what's the word, powerful or effective. I'll give you an example, okay? I have a challenging relationship with my mom, right? It's a real example, So now I'm going for therapy and I'm working through my emotional regulations, and trying to see my mom in a more contextual understanding and where she's coming from, and etc., right? So I'm doing all of that. I've done all of that. I'm in a very more perhaps I've gotten to a place of like accepting my mom for who she is, being more like forgiving and things like that, right? So I am in that space on an individual level. But now if you bring my mom in, okay, and let's say we're talking, and my mom might say something to the effect of what has happened or something that would trigger me. So I have this understanding, but my mom's presence has triggered something in me in that moment, right? So what can happen here is if there's a family therapist, with my mom's presence there, they're able to kind of like, what's happening for you in your body right now as you're hearing this, right? So it's a very different change that will happen, right? Because what's going to happen then, I'm going to be able to then perhaps voice out things that I have probably done the work in my head, but maybe here I get to voice it out. And my mom might be able to hear me in ways that she has never heard me before with the help of a therapist, right? And I'm able to say it in a way where I'm just not sort of like rationalizing it, but I'm emotionally present in that relationship, right? So, can you imagine how different it is to do the work individually as compared to doing it with the person that you're really struggling with? Because the shift then will be on a much deeper level. That's what I would believe.
Yeah. So if you work with an individual, developing awareness and perhaps having the person understand that there's different ways of maybe communicating and responding that can potentially more effectively fulfill their needs, that they can then go back to their family or their relationships and try to instill those changes. But nevertheless, it's going to be more powerful if there is a family therapist in the room together with the people in those relationships, because there and then changes can be made or awareness can develop with those individuals.
Yes. Also, perhaps if I'm doing an individual work, right, with my counselor is only hearing and seeing me. But then when the counselor sees me in context of my relationship with my mom, perhaps when my mom is talking, maybe I'm doing something, maybe something is happening to me that I don't realize, that a family therapist is able to highlight. I noticed that you flinched when your mom said this. I noticed that you're unable to look at your mom when she's talking to you, right? Like, so those things you cannot see and cannot get this information when you're doing individual counseling.
So all in all, if I were to safely summarize this, it's going to be much better if you have the participation of more members, whether in the family or in the couple relationship, rather than the individual on their own. But it's also possible to work with an individual, perhaps not as powerful as having more people together during the session.
Yeah, so that's my belief. But at the end of the day, I'm also a big believer of respecting the autonomy of the individual, right? So if the individual say, I don't want to do any work with my family, I just want to focus on myself and how I am going to be moving forward, I think that's also there needs to be that space to respect that choice as well.
Okay, so I think we have spoken about family therapy or couples therapy and how it works. Perhaps is a little bit more less straightforward than what people might think. Usually people might think that, oh, I'm feeling depressed and I'm going to work on myself. A therapist can help me with that. But in your explanation, then it does sound like, it's a broader perspective than just focus on the individual. Now, if there are couples and families that maybe are in certain, troubles right now, family relationships are not going well, or maybe the parents are concerned about their child who's maybe having behavioral issues, or maybe in a couple relationships, the relationship is distant or maybe in conflict. What's one piece of advice or something practical that you think they might want to consider in your professional opinion?
I think one is that as much as it is normal to have problems in family, right? Because sometimes we like to make this blanket statement. It's normal to have fights. It's very normal to have arguments and things like that. We need to also keep in mind that some things can become patterns and some patterns can be very dysfunctional. And when it gets very dysfunctional, a lot of times individuals will feel alone in the relationships. And that's where it gets really it becomes really sad because it's very disconnecting. So my biggest core message out there, my hope is that I hope that people are aware that they have a choice to break patterns. That especially when it's becoming dysfunctional, when you notice there's a repetitive way that you and your partner are fighting, or you notice there's a repetition in the way that the conversations are going, maybe it's time to just take a step back and say, can we change the way we are communicating here? Can we change the way we are arguing, right? So that's one. And secondly, I also want to say that I think people tend to treat therapy, and I'm sure this is true for any mental health professionals, they tend to treat therapy as like emergency care, like when you're physically really unwell, you have to go to the emergency because you start seeing symptoms like blood or tumors or things like that, right? But instead of treating therapy as emergency sort of like care, to look at it more like a regular medical checkup, right? So you don't need to have like a big problem, but maybe you can pay attention to, I think something can change here, and why don't we just go for therapy to talk about these things so that we can see how we could be different, right? So when the conflict is still small, or when you notice the distance is still small, perhaps going and getting a deeper understanding where you get to learn different ways to be with each other would be great.
Yeah, a bit like how in the field of medicine, it's something called preventive medicine, where it's not about treating a pathology, but rather before things actually get worse, what can we do about it? And in psychology, there's also the field of positive psychology. So even if things are going along well, but things can be even better. So in every family, there can be something that is, quote unquote, dysfunctional, but it's not to the extent that family members are breaking away or cutting ties. But nevertheless, these are certain issues that can be addressed so that family members can live more harmoniously, or they can enjoy a higher quality of life. And even with those concerns, although it's not like super concerning or not super urgent, these are some of the concerns that we can more actively address to better enjoy life.
Yes.
Okay. So with that, Christine, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this episode today.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope the audience have a better idea on how families and couples can be helped, as well as how individuals who may present with certain concerns perhaps have a larger reason why they might be behaving or feeling that way. And that might come in the context of the relationships around them.
Yes, correct. Me too. I hope the same too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for
you,
your
Alvin.
contribution today.
Thank you.
Yeah. That wraps up today's episode of Be Kind to Your Mind. If you found this episode meaningful, please share it with someone who might benefit, and don't forget to follow us on Spotify or YouTube for more conversations like this. I'll be back with another episode next month. Until then, take care and be kind to your mind.